2018, 347,000 people paid money to walk into a single building on the outskirts of Hobart. Hobart is the capital of Tasmania, an island of about 500,000 people that has been, by household income, the poorest state in Australia for as long as anybody has kept the figures. It is the second oldest city on the continent, older than Melbourne by 3 decades, and for a century and a half its most reliable export was its own young people, who left on ships and then on aeroplanes for the mainland, and did not come back. Since 2013, Qantas has grown its capacity into the Hobart airport by 63%, and Jetstar by 17%. In 2013, Lonely Planet named the city one of the 10 best places on Earth to visit that year. Something moved Hobart from the first of those conditions to the second, and it was not a mine, and it was not a factory, and it was not a government program. It was one man from the island who worked out, at a card table in a casino the state had built to save itself, that gambling was a mathematics problem. Chapter 1. The Rivulet and the Mountain. Everything at Hobart follows from the water. The Derwent below the town is not really a river. It is a drowned valley, an arm of the Southern Ocean pushed inland for tens of kilometres, wide and cold and deep enough that a vessel of almost any draft can lie close in against the western shore without touching bottom. Ships come up to it from the south, past the long dark line of Bruny Island and across Storm Bay, into water that never freezes, never silts, and is sheltered from every wind that matters. Most ports in the world are a compromise between depth, shelter, and access to land. Hobart was not a compromise. It was a harbour of the first rank sitting empty at the bottom of the map, waiting for somebody to invent a reason to use it. Behind the anchorage, the ground climbs immediately. Kunanyi, which the British named Mount Wellington, stands more than 1,200 metres above the water, close enough that from the waterfront it takes up a third of the sky, with a wall of vertical dolerite columns across its face that the town has always called the organ pipes. Snow falls on it in every month of the year, including January. Off its lower slopes runs a small, fast, permanent stream of fresh water, dropping through gullies of tree fern and stringy bark, crossing the flat ground behind the cove and emptying into the harbour. It is called the Hobart Rivulet. Deep salt water and clean fresh water within a few hundred metres of each other at the end of the inhabited world. People had been living on that ground for a very long time. The country around the Derwent estuary belonged to the Muinina, one of the bands of the Southeast Nation, part of the wider Aboriginal population of the island, who had been isolated from the mainland since the sea came up and closed Bass Strait roughly 10,000 years earlier. They had the mountain, the estuary, the shellfish beds, and a landscape they burned and managed. They had been there by the archaeology for something in the order of 40,000 years, which is a figure that gets revised upward more often than downward. The British came because of the French. In 1802, Nicolas Baudin's expedition had surveyed the Derwent and the d'Entrecasteaux Channel with the thoroughness of men making a case for a claim, and the administration in Sydney read the charts and drew the obvious conclusion. In September 1803, Lieutenant John Bowen landed on the eastern bank of the estuary at Risdon Cove with fewer than 50 people, about half of them convicts, and put up a camp. The site was wrong almost at once. The water there was unreliable and the ground was poor. In February 1804, Lieutenant Governor David Collins, who had arrived with a much larger party after abandoning a failed settlement on Port Phillip Bay, moved the whole operation across to the western shore to a small indentation in the coastline with a stream running into it. He called it Sullivan's Cove. The stream was the rivulet. The first serious violence came within months. On the 3rd of May 1804, a large party of Aboriginal people moving through the country near Risdon Cove, driving kangaroo, came within sight of the remaining camp there, and the soldiers opened fire on them, including with a small artillery piece. The number killed has never been settled and never will be. Estimates given at the time and since run from 3 to 50. The accounts contradict each other, and no serious inquiry was ever held. What is not in dispute is that it took place in the 4th month of the settlement's existence, and that everything that followed on the island between the two populations followed from a position that had already been established. The place took its name from a man who never came near it. Robert Hobart, 4th Earl of Buckinghamshire, was Secretary of State for War and the Colonies in London at the moment the settlement was made, and the town was called Hobart Town in his honour, which was standard practice and required nothing whatever of him. The word town was dropped in 1881. Nearly every street on the original grid carries the same species of name: an official, a patron, a governor, a man at a desk on the other side of the planet who would be told about the place by letter 8 months after the fact. The town went up on the flat between the rivulet and the water. Streets were laid out on a grid running back from the cove, named for colonial officials and English politicians who would never see them, and the whole thing sat under the mountain like something set down at the foot of a wall. It had a magnificent harbour, an unlimited supply of fresh water, timber on every hill, and a stone quarry within walking distance of the wharf. What it did not have was a purpose, and the Empire had already decided what the purpose would be. It was going to arrive in the holds of ships in irons. Chapter 2. The Stone and the Chain. Between 1803 and 1853, the British transported something in the order of 75,000 convicts to Van Diemen's Land. The exact figure varies with who is counting and what they count, but the order of magnitude is not disputed, and it is worth holding against the population of the place because for long stretches of the first half of the 19th century, convicts and former convicts made up the majority of the non-Aboriginal people on the island. New South Wales received more in absolute numbers. Van Diemen's Land received more in proportion to everything else it had. After transportation to the mainland east coast was wound back in 1840, the island took nearly all of it, and the system that had been designed as a component of a colony became, for more than a decade, the colony itself. Convict labour built Hobart. That is not a rhetorical statement about the general contribution of an underclass. It is a description of who was holding the tools. The sandstone came out of quarries on the slopes above the town and off the domain, cut by men in government gangs, dressed by men in government gangs, and set by masons who, in a great many cases, had arrived under sentence. The stone itself is a soft yellow sandstone that soars easily when it comes out of the ground and hardens in the air, which is exactly the material you want if your workforce is unskilled, unwilling, and unpaid. It is why Hobart looks the way it looks. Almost every substantial building put up in the town before 1860 is made of the same stone from the same hills, which is why the old city has a colour rather than a style. The list of what they built is the list of what still stands. The Theatre Royal on Campbell Street, begun in 1834 and still in use, is the oldest continuously operating theatre in Australia. St David's Park is the old burial ground, with the headstones now set into walls around the edge. Anglesea Barracks on the hill above Davy Street, dating from 1811, remains the oldest military establishment in the country still occupied by the Army. The Cascades Female Factory in South Hobart, opened in 1828 on damp ground, in the shadow of the mountain where the sun in winter reaches the yard for only a few hours a day, held women under sentence in a set of walled compounds, sorted by class of offence, with a nursery attached in which infant mortality ran at rates that alarmed even the officials responsible for it. The women in that yard were not a minor administrative footnote. Something over 12,000 convict women were transported to Van Diemen's Land, and the Cascades establishment was where a great many of them passed through between assignments, punishments, and childbirth. Women who offended in service were returned there. Women who became pregnant in service were returned there. The crime rate recorded against them was overwhelmingly composed of insolence, absence without leave, drunkenness, and refusal to work, which is what the criminal record of an unfree domestic servant looks like when the servant has no other instrument of protest available. Outside the walls, the town filled in. By the 1830s, Hobart had newspapers, a bank, a botanical garden begun in 1818 on the domain above the river, churches in the same Yellowstone, merchants, shipwrights, coopers, rope walks, and a customs house. It had a governor with an unusual amount of money to spend on public works because the labour cost nothing, and in George Arthur, who ran the colony from 1824 to 1836, it had an administrator with a genuine talent for systems. Arthur turned the convict establishment into a machine of gradations, with assignment at the top and secondary punishment at the bottom, and a written record following every man through it. And in the country beyond the settled districts, the other campaign was being conducted at the same time. Through the 1820s, the colonists and the Aboriginal population fought what has been called the Black War, and the colonial government declared martial law over the settled districts in 1828. In 1830, Arthur put more than 2,000 men into a line across the island, soldiers, settlers, and convicts, and marched them south in an attempt to sweep the remaining Aboriginal people onto the Tasman Peninsula. The Black Line cost the government a great deal of money and captured 2 people. The removals that followed did what the line had not, and the survivors were shipped to a settlement at Wyberlena on Flinders Island in Bass Strait, where they died of respiratory disease at a rate that emptied the place within 15 years. Down at the wharves, meanwhile, Hobart had found something to sell. Chapter 3. Oil. The thing about the Southern Ocean in the first half of the 19th century is that it was full of whales, and the whales were worth more than almost anything else that could be loaded onto a ship. Sperm oil burned clean and bright and lubricated machinery that nothing else would lubricate. Black oil from right whales went into lamps, soap, and the treatment of leather and wool. Whalebone went into every stiffened garment in Europe. And the southern right whales came up the Derwent itself to carve, in numbers that the earliest settlers recorded with astonishment and then with irritation, because the animals kept the small boats awake at night. Hobart became a whaling port because it was standing in the right place. It was the last deep water harbour before the ice. It had timber and cooperage and shipwrights, and it sat directly on the grounds. Bay whaling stations went up around the Derwent on Bruny Island, along the D'Entrecasteaux Channel, and around the southern coast, catching the right whales in the calving season from small open boats launched off the beach. Deep sea whalers went out of Sullivan's Cove for the sperm grounds and stayed away for years at a time. By the 1830s and 1840s, Hobart was one of the great whaling ports of the southern hemisphere, and for a period in the middle of the century, it had a whaling fleet second in the British Empire only to the ports of the North Atlantic. The money from it went into stone, on the water, in a row. Salamanca Place is a line of sandstone warehouses on the western side of Sullivan's Cove, 4 stories of them, built through the 1830s into the 1840s at the foot of a bluff, with the mountain directly behind and the water directly in front. They were built to hold whale oil, wheat, wool, apples, timber, and imported goods, and they were built at a scale that assumed the trade would continue indefinitely. The stone came from the quarry immediately behind them. Above the warehouses, on the bluff, the merchants put up Battery Point, a district of small streets and colonial houses looking down onto their own cargo. The port built its own ships as well. Yards at Battery Point and around the edges of the cove turned out barks, brigs, schooners, and whaleboats, and the timber was part of the advantage. Blue gum for framing and planking, hard and heavy and standing in quantity on every hill behind the town. Huon pine for anything that had to stay in the water, a tree that grows in the wet river country of the south and west so slowly that a trunk a man could not put his arms around may have been standing for 1,000 years, and that carries in its grain an oil which resists rot and marine borer almost indefinitely. Those trees were cut, floated down the Gordon and the Huon, and made into hulls, and the hulls went out into the Southern Ocean to kill whales. Imagine standing on Salamanca Place on a morning in 1841. The warehouses on your left are new, the stone still pale and sharp at the edges where it came off the saw, and the doors on the upper floors are open with hoists swinging out over the street. In front of you, the cove is full of masts. Whaling barks back from the sperm grounds after 2- and 3-year voyages lie alongside colonial traders, government brigs and vessels down from Sydney, and the water between them is crowded with lighters. Casks are coming off the ships and going up the street on drays behind draft horses, and the whole waterfront smells of whale oil, which is a smell people wrote home about and never described favourably. Coopers are working in the open. Behind all of it, the mountain goes up into cloud, and there is snow on it in what is supposed to be the middle of summer. And the men rolling the casks and cutting the stone and driving the drays are, a great many of them, working under sentence and going back at nightfall to a barracks. The town those years produced was, by any measure available at the time, a success. Hobart in the 1840s had a population in the tens of thousands, a shipbuilding industry, a customs revenue, an export trade, and a set of public buildings that would not have embarrassed a provincial city in England. It was the administrative centre of a colony that had been carved out as a separate entity from New South Wales in 1825. It had a mercantile class with money and pretensions, a serious newspaper trade, and an economy resting on three legs: whale oil, wool, and the vast, permanently subsidised business of housing and feeding the empire's prisoners. Every one of those three legs was about to be removed inside 20 years, 90-odd kilometres to the southeast of the wharves, on a peninsula joined to the rest of the island by a neck of sand a few dozen metres across. The same government was running the other half of its operation. Chapter 4. The Peninsula. Port Arthur was established in 1830. It began as a timber station, because the Tasman Peninsula had stands of workable forest and a water frontage, and it grew into the most complete penal settlement the British ever built in Australia. Geography did the work of walls. The peninsula connects to the Forestier Peninsula at Eaglehawk Neck, a strip of sand so narrow that a line of dogs chained across it, with lamps and men, was considered sufficient to close the road. The water on both sides was cold enough and the sharks were talked about enough that most prisoners believed swimming was not an option, and the administration made certain the belief was maintained. At its height, the settlement held well over 1,000 convicts, along with soldiers, civil officers, and their families. It had a flour mill and granary, a hospital, a church built by convict labour and never consecrated, a government farm, saw pits, a shipyard that launched dozens of vessels, and a tramway on which convicts pushed carriages by hand across the peninsula. It also had one of the first juvenile reformatories in the empire. Point Poorest, established across the water from the main settlement in the 1830s, held boys, some of them as young as 9, separately from the adult population, and taught them trades. The theory was enlightened. The practice included flogging. The instrument that made Port Arthur notorious was not the lash. Through the 1840s, the administration built the separate prison, a radial block modelled on the silent system, then fashionable in Britain, and moved punishment from the body to the mind. A man in the separate prison was held in a cell alone. He was not spoken to. Warders wore felt over their boots. He was known by a number rather than by a name. When he was taken out for exercise, he wore a hood with eye slits so that he could not see or be seen by another prisoner, and when he was taken to chapel, he was placed in a stall with high partitions from which he could see the minister and nothing else. The sentence was measured in days and weeks of this, and it was applied to men who had already been transported to the other side of the world. An asylum was built beside the separate prison. The colonial authorities did not connect the two facts in their correspondence with any great enthusiasm, but they built the asylum next to the prison, and they filled it. The medical officers recorded men who had stopped speaking, men who could not tolerate light, men who had lost the ability to be in a room with other people. Some of them had arrived on the island for theft of goods valued at a few shillings. Across a short stretch of water from the settlement is a small island of about an acre called the Isle of the Dead. Everybody who died at Port Arthur went into it, and burials there ran into the hundreds and by most accounts somewhat over 1,000. The ground was divided. Officers, soldiers, civil officers, and their wives and children were buried on the higher part of the island with headstones. Convicts were buried on the lower part in unmarked graves, several to a pit. The man who dug those graves for a period in the 1840s was himself a convict, housed alone on the island, which is a detail that would seem invented if the record did not carry it. Port Arthur ran for 47 years. It closed in 1877, 24 years after the last convict transport had unloaded, by which time it was functioning mainly as a home for aged and broken men that nobody else would house. The colonial government then did what governments do with an embarrassment. It renamed the district Carnarvon, subdivided the land, and sold the buildings for what they would fetch. Bushfires went through the ruins twice in the 1890s and took the roofs off the church and the penitentiary. Within a generation, the site had become a tourist attraction, which it has remained ever since. The name of the colony went the same way. Transportation to Van Diemen's Land ended in 1853, and in 1856 the colony formally renamed itself Tasmania, after the Dutch navigator who had sighted the coast in 1642 and had the good fortune to be dead. The stated reason was pride in the island's own discovery. The actual reason was that the words Van Diemen's Land had come to mean one thing in every English-speaking port in the world, and no free settler with capital wanted to be associated with it. The renaming worked about as well as renamings do. What it could not fix was the arithmetic, because when transportation stopped, the largest single source of money in the Tasmanian economy stopped with it. Chapter 5. The Long Subtraction. The convict system had been an enormous transfer payment from the British Treasury. London paid for the ships, the rations, the uniforms, the barracks, the officers, the soldiers, and the medical staff, and the money was spent in Hobart, in shops and stores and yards owned by free colonists. Contracts to supply flour, beef, boots, and slop clothing to the commissariat had made fortunes. When transportation ended in 1853, the contracts ended with it, and the island's principal customer, which had never been a customer at all but a government department, simply closed the account. The whales went at almost the same moment, and for the ordinary reason. The southern right whale populations along the Tasmanian coast had been reduced to the point where the bay stations could no longer fill their casks, and the deep sea grounds were being worked by fleets from everywhere. Then, in 1859, a man drilled a well in Pennsylvania and found rock oil, and within 2 decades the price of whale oil for lighting had been undercut in every market that mattered. Hobart's fleet shrank through the 1860s and 1870s, and then was gone. The warehouses at Salamanca went on being used for wheat and jam and apples and general cargo, and then went on being used less. The third subtraction was people. Gold was found in Victoria in 1851, and Tasmanians left for it in numbers that emptied whole districts. Contemporary estimates suggested that a substantial share of the adult male population of the colony crossed Bass Strait inside a few years, and while many came back, a great many did not. The pattern established itself in those years and then never went away. When there was work on the mainland, Tasmanians went to it. Melbourne, which had been a village on Port Phillip Bay when Hobart was a stone city with a theatre, passed it in the 1850s and never looked back, and the traffic across the strait ran in one direction for the next century and a half. There were partial answers. Tin was found at Mount Bischoff in the northwest in 1871 and turned out to be one of the richest deposits in the world. Copper came out of Mount Lyell on the west coast from the 1890s. In country so wet and so steep that the mining town of Queenstown ended up standing on hills stripped bare by a combination of logging and sulfur fumes, a landscape people came to look at because it resembled somewhere else entirely. Silver and lead came out of Zeehan, but the mines were all in the north and the west, and the money from them went out through Launceston, Burnie and Strahan. Hobart in the second half of the 19th century was an administrative capital with a magnificent harbour and a declining share of its own island's business, and the original population of the island was being written out of existence at the same time, in a manner that was itself a kind of colonial project. Truganini, a woman of the Nuenon people of Bruny Island, who had lived through the whole of it, from first contact to Wibalena to the removals, died in Hobart on the 8th of May, 1876. She had asked to be buried at sea. She was instead interred, then exhumed within 2 years, and her skeleton was placed on public display in the Tasmanian Museum, where it remained for decades. She was described at the time, and for a century afterward, as the last of her people, which was untrue, and which served a purpose for those who repeated it. The Aboriginal community of Tasmania, descended in large part from the women of the Bass Strait Islands, did not stop existing because the colony found it convenient to say so. Truganini's remains were finally cremated and scattered on the D'Entrecasteaux Channel in 1976, 100 years after her death. Tasmania federated with the other colonies in 1901 as the smallest and poorest state in the new Commonwealth, and the position was structural rather than temporary. It had a small population, a long coastline, high transport costs on everything it bought and everything it sold, and no capacity to hold its own graduates. Every measure the Commonwealth Bureau developed in the 20th century put Tasmania at or near the bottom. Average weekly earnings, bottom. Household income, bottom. School retention, bottom. It received special grants from the Commonwealth almost from the beginning, and the grants became permanent, and the permanence became the identity. By the 1910s, the state government had settled on the one asset the island possessed in genuine abundance and had begun to dam it. Chapter 6. Water and Watts. The rain that comes off the Southern Ocean hits the west coast of Tasmania and drops, and the mountains hold lakes, and the water runs downhill in quantities that are absurd relative to the size of the island. Beginning before the First World War and continuing for 70 years, Tasmania set out to convert that water into industry. The Hydroelectric Department, which became the Hydroelectric Commission in 1930, built dams, tunnels, pipelines, and power stations across the Central Highlands and the West, and it did so with a mandate that was never really about electricity. It was about using cheap power as a lure. The strategy had a name that Tasmanians used without irony for decades. They called it hydro-industrialization. It worked in the narrow sense that it brought factories. The electrolytic zinc company opened works at Risdon on the eastern shore of the Derwent, a few kilometres upstream from Hobart, from 1917, and the plant became one of the largest zinc producers in the world and the largest single industrial employer in the south of the state. Cadbury built a chocolate factory at Claremont on the western shore in the 1920s, complete with a model village for its workers, on a site chosen for its water frontage and its access to Tasmanian dairy. A paper mill went up at Boyer on the Derwent above the city in the 1940s, producing newsprint from Tasmanian timber. Aluminium came to Bell Bay in the north in the 1950s. The hydro became the largest employer in the state and something closer to a parallel government, with its own townships, its own workforce, its own engineering culture, and a degree of political immunity that no elected minister cared to test. For the first time since transportation, Hobart had a set of large employers that paid regular wages and a working class that could buy a house on the eastern shore or in the northern suburbs. The population of the greater city climbed through the middle of the century. It did not, however, close the gap with the mainland because the mainland was growing faster. Tasmania stayed at the bottom of every table, and the industries the hydro had attracted were, without exception, the kind of industry that comes to a place because power is cheap, which is another way of saying that they were the kind of industry that leaves when power is cheap somewhere else. The young left steadily. It was not a crisis. There was never a single closure or a single year that produced a headline. It was a continuous drain of 18 and 22-year-olds going north for university places, apprenticeships, wages, and, above all, the possibility of a career with more than two employers in it, and the demographic effect compounded quietly across a century. The people who stayed were disproportionately those with land, those with a government job, and those with nowhere else to go. Every so often, a Tasmanian premier would announce a program to reverse it. None of them did. By the end of the 1960s, the hydro's remaining opportunities were running out, and the state was looking for other ideas. Tourism was one. Tasmania had scenery in quantities that nobody had yet worked out how to sell, and it had the problem that has always defined tourism to the island, which is that there is water in the way. Every visitor arrives by ship or by aeroplane. Every visitor is therefore expensive to acquire, and for most of the 20th century, the visitor who did arrive came in summer, stayed a week, and left the state to shut down for the other 9 months. Hobart in July was a cold, quiet, low-rise city under a snow-covered mountain, with the tourist trade closed and the restaurants closed and the daylight gone by 4:30. There was one more thing the state had, and it was the bridge. The Derwent at Hobart is wide, and until 1943, the only way to get from the eastern shore to the city was by ferry. The floating bridge that opened that year was replaced in 1964 by the Tasman Bridge, a concrete structure of 22 spans running more than a kilometre across the estuary on tall piers. It carried the highway to the airport and the east coast. It carried tens of thousands of vehicles a day. It was the single piece of infrastructure that made the eastern shore suburbs possible, and by the middle of the 1970s, something over a third of the greater Hobart population lived on the far side of it. On the evening of Sunday, January 5th, 1975, a bulk ore carrier came up the Derwent in the dark with a cargo of zinc concentrate for the works at Risdon. Chapter 7, 12 seconds. The vessel was the Lake Illawarra, a bulk carrier of the Australian coastal trade, and she was carrying something in the order of 10,000 tonnes of zinc concentrate. She came up the river on a Sunday evening in summer with clear weather and good visibility, approaching the Tasman Bridge on a line that would take her through the navigation span. She did not go through the navigation span. She went off course, could not recover, and struck the piers. 2 piers went, and with them a length of the deck slab above. A section of the bridge, roughly 130 metres long, dropped into the river, and about 30 metres of it landed on the ship, which sank in the channel in a matter of minutes with the concrete on top of her. 7 of her crew died. The Lake Illawarra is still on the bottom of the Derwent at that spot, with her cargo in her, and vessels are advised against anchoring over her. On the bridge above there was now a gap in the dark, on a road carrying traffic in both directions. 4 cars went into it before anyone could stop the flow. 5 people in those cars died. 2 more cars went over the edge and stopped with their front wheels hanging in the air. And the photographs of those vehicles balanced on a broken concrete edge with the river 45 metres below are the images by which the night is remembered. The total death toll was 12, 7 from the ship and 5 from the road. What followed was not the disaster. What followed was the consequence, and it lasted longer than anyone was prepared for. The Tasman Bridge was the only crossing of the Derwent anywhere near Hobart. With it gone, the eastern shore, home to a substantial fraction of the city, was severed from the city centre, from the general hospital, from the courts, from the government offices, and from most of the jobs. The nearest alternative crossing was the causeway at Bridgewater, far upstream, which turned a 5-minute drive into a round trip of many tens of kilometres on roads never built for it. People sat in traffic for hours a day. Ambulances took the long way. Businesses on the eastern shore lost their customers, and businesses in the city lost their staff. The state put ferries back on the river for the first time in 30 years, pulling vessels from wherever they could be found, and the ferries ran and were not enough. A temporary Bailey Bridge was thrown across at Risdon in December 1975, 11 months after the collapse, a single-lane structure with alternating traffic that immediately became one of the most congested pieces of road in Australia. Schools reorganised. Some families moved house rather than continue commuting. Others changed jobs to stay on their own side of the water. The eastern shore developed its own shopping centres and its own services during those years, for the simple reason that reaching the old ones had become impractical, and the pattern outlasted the emergency. The Tasman Bridge reopened on the 8th of October 1977, 2 years and 9 months. A city of that size does not absorb an event of that length without deformation, and Hobart did not. The eastern shore had been made a suburb of a city it could not reach, and it stayed partly separate afterward. Property values on the 2 sides of the river diverged. A generation of Hobart residents divided their memories into before and after in the way that people usually reserve for wars. It also arrived at the worst possible moment for a state that had spent the decade advertising itself as a destination. Tasmania, in the 1970s and 1980s, was in the national news for the bridge, and then for the flooding of Lake Pedder, and then for the Franklin, where the Hydroelectric Commission proposed to dam the Gordon below its junction with the Franklin River and drown one of the last temperate wilderness river systems on Earth. The blockade in the summer of 1982 and 1983 put more than 1,000 people through the police cells at Strahan and Hobart. The dispute went to the High Court, and in July 1983, the court found for the Commonwealth and the dam was stopped. The Hydro's 70-year run as the shaper of the Tasmanian economy ended that day, and the state was left with a wilderness it had just been told it could not touch, a reputation for internal warfare, and no new plan. 2 years before the Lake Illawarra came up the river, the government had opened its other answer on the water at Sandy Bay. Chapter 8. The House. Gambling in Australia in the 1960s was legal at the racecourse and illegal almost everywhere else, and the country's casinos were rooms above shops with a man on the door. In 1968, the Tasmanian government put the question to a referendum whether to license a casino at Hobart. The proposal was carried narrowly, and the reasoning behind it was stated openly at the time. because there was nothing to hide. Tasmania was poor, Tasmania could not attract industry, Tasmania could not hold its young people, and Tasmania had winter. A casino would bring mainland visitors in the off-season, it would create construction work, it would produce tax revenue, and it would put the island in the newspapers for something other than being cold. Rest Point Hotel Casino opened at Sandy Bay in February 1973, on a point of land jutting into the Derwent a short way downstream from the city centre, on the site of an old hotel of the same name. It was the first legal casino in Australia. The building is a circular tower rising out of a low podium on the water, and it remains the tallest building in Tasmania, which tells you a good deal about both the tower and about Tasmania. Aeroplanes came down from Melbourne and Sydney full of people who had never previously considered a holiday in Hobart. For a few years the arithmetic looked promising, then New South Wales licensed casinos, then Queensland, then Victoria, Western Australia, South Australia, the Northern Territory. Every advantage Rest Point had was a legislative advantage, and legislative advantages have a half-life. By the 1980s, a Sydney resident who wanted to play blackjack no longer needed to fly across Bass Strait, and Tasmania was left with a casino, a hotel, several hundred jobs, a stream of state revenue from gaming taxes that has continued ever since, and a state economy still sitting at the bottom of every table in the country. The casino had been sold to the electorate as a rescue. It employed people, it paid tax, and it rescued nothing. Tasmania in 1990 was still the poorest state in Australia by household income, still losing its young, still waiting. What Rest Point actually produced does not appear in any of the projections that were put to the voters in 1968. In the 1980s, a young man from Glenorchy, in Hobart's northern suburbs, was sitting at the blackjack tables in that building working out that the game was solvable. His name was David Walsh. He had gone to the University of Tasmania to study mathematics and computing and had dropped out. And what he had instead of a degree was an unusual facility with probability and a temperament suited to grinding a very small statistical advantage over a very large number of repetitions. Blackjack is the one casino game in which the composition of the remaining deck changes the odds, which means a player who tracks the cards can identify the moments when the advantage sits with him rather than with the house and bet accordingly. It is not a secret. It is a mathematical fact about the game, and the house response to it has never been to change the mathematics but to change the player by asking him to leave. Walsh got better at it, and he found people who were better at other parts of it. The most important of them was Zelko Ranagajek, another Tasmanian, another University of Tasmania student, another man who had worked out the same thing about the same tables. Together, they built what became known as the bankroll, a betting syndicate that stopped playing cards and started attacking parimutuel pools. The distinction matters. In a casino, you bet against the house, and the house sets the odds. In a totalizator pool, you bet against the other bettors, and the odds are set by where the money goes, which means the question is no longer whether you can beat a game, but whether you can model a crowd better than the crowd models itself. They built proprietary software to do it, they hired mathematicians and programmers, and they applied it to horse racing, sport and lotteries in Australia and then around the world. At its peak, the operation was turning over something in the order of $10 billion a year in bets, not profit, turnover. The margin was thin and the volume was enormous, and it was run out of an island with 500,000 people on it. In 2003, Walsh had money on the Melbourne Cup. Chapter 9, The Hole in the Cliff. The bet returned more than $11 million on the first Tuesday in November. It is the single most publicly known thing about David Walsh's betting career, and it is also in the context of the bankroll's turnover, an ordinary Tuesday with a good result. His personal fortune has been put at around $200 million, though the estimates vary widely and the syndicate has never had any reason to clarify them. What he did with it was buy a peninsula. In the 1990s, Walsh acquired the Marilla estate on the Berrydale Peninsula, a dozen kilometres upriver from central Hobart, on the western shore of the Derwent, a vineyard property with a modernist house on it and water on 3 sides. He began buying antiquities, then contemporary art, and he opened a small museum on the site to show them. It was modest, it was little visited, and by his own account it did not work. So he decided to build something that would. The architect was Nonda Katsalidis of Fender Katsalidis, a Melbourne practice with a record of building tall things. What Walsh asked for was, in structural terms, the opposite of tall. The Berriedale Peninsula is a sandstone bluff standing directly out of the estuary, and the building went into it. Above ground there is a single story, a low structure that from the water reads as almost nothing, a line of rusted steel and glass on the top of a cliff. Below ground there are 3 levels, cut down into the sandstone, with the raw, quarried rock face left exposed as an interior wall in places, so that the visitor is standing inside the geology of the peninsula, rather than in a room placed upon it. Cutting the rooms out came first, and it was most of the job. The contractors took the top off the peninsula, and then went down into it, and the stone that came out was the same soft yellow sandstone the government gangs had quarried on the other side of the river 170 years earlier to build the warehouses at Salamanca and the barracks on the hill. The same bed laid down in the same shallow sea. It went out of the site in trucks. What was left behind was a void with the estuary on one side and raw quarry face on the other, and into that void went a building with almost nothing above it. The circulation is the argument. A visitor arrives at the top and then descends by a spiral staircase that goes down through the rock to the lowest level and works upward from there. Frank Lloyd Wright's Guggenheim in New York puts the visitor at the top of a ramp and lets him wind down through the collection in a controlled spiral, and it is the most quoted museum plan of the 20th century. Berriedale takes the same gesture and turns it upside down. You go down into the ground first, into the dark, with no natural light and no view of the river, and everything after that is a return toward the surface. It cost 75 million Australian dollars. It opened on 21st of January 2011, and it was called the Museum of Old and New Art, which nobody has ever said in full. Walsh has described it as a subversive adult Disneyland, and the description was accurate enough that it stuck. The 2 subjects the collection returns to are sex and death, stated plainly without the apologetic framing museums normally apply. Sidney Nolan's Snake, a wall of more than 1,600 individual painted panels, occupies its own chamber. Wim Delvoye's Cloaca Professional is a machine that is fed food at one end and produces, on a schedule, exactly what a digestive system produces, and it is displayed with the same lighting and the same seriousness as everything else. There are Egyptian mummies and Roman coins in the same building. There are no labels on the walls. Instead, every visitor is handed a device that knows where it is standing and tells you what you are looking at, along with, in some cases, an essay by Walsh explaining why he bought it and what he thinks of it now. The gift shop is not by the exit in the ordinary sense, because there is no ordinary exit. There is a bar underground. There is a tennis court on the roof of the collection. The owner lives on the site. From May 2011, visitors from interstate and overseas paid admission. Tasmanians have always entered free, and still do, and that decision was made early and has never been reversed. A ferry runs up the Derwent from the Hobart waterfront to a set of steps cut into the cliff, and the visitor climbs those steps from the water to the door, which means the approach to the building is a slow ascent from the river, with the sandstone face going up on either side. Nothing in the history of Tasmanian economic development had prepared anybody for what happened next. Chapter 10. The Cost of Arriving. In 2018, the museum on the Berriedale Peninsula received 347,000 visitors. Since opening, it has issued almost 2.5 million tickets. It states that it has created about 1,300 direct and indirect jobs, and its total economic contribution to Tasmania in the 2017 to 2018 financial year was put at $134.5 million, which is a figure that would be respectable for a mid-sized industrial plant and is extraordinary for a private art collection at the bottom of the world. It also solved the problem the casino had been built to solve, and did it from the opposite direction. Rest Point had been designed to import mainland gamblers in the off-season. What arrived after 2011 was a different kind of visitor entirely, and the mechanism was dark mofo. The Winter Festival, first held in 2013, took the coldest, darkest, deadest weeks of the Tasmanian year, the weeks in which Hobart had historically closed and made them the reason to come. Fires in the streets, installations in disused industrial buildings, red light on the waterfront, a swim in the Derwent at dawn on the shortest day of the year, in water that is not survivable for long. Hotels that had run at nothing in June ran full. Mona Foma, the summer festival, ran alongside it until it was cancelled in 2024. The airlines followed, which is the measure that matters most for an island. Since 2013, Qantas has grown its capacity into Hobart by 63% and Jetstar by 17%. Lonely Planet named the city a top 10 global destination for 2013 and named the museum as the reason. Restaurants opened, distilleries opened. The Salamanca warehouses, which had spent the 20th century as low-rent storage and then as a Saturday craft market, filled with businesses that could pay commercial rent. A city that had exported its own young people for a century and a half started, for the first time in its recorded history, to have a problem with people wanting to move in. That is where the story turns. Hobart is now the least affordable city in Australia in which to rent, and it holds that position for the second year running. Not the most expensive, the least affordable, which is a different measurement and a worse one, because it compares what people pay to what people earn. A median rent of $520 a week takes 28% of the income of the median renting household in the city, and that household earns $95,803 a year. Sydney is more expensive. Melbourne is more expensive. Neither of them takes as much of a renter's pay packet as Hobart does. The line by which it got there is short and steep. In November 2016, the median rent in Hobart was $357 a week. By June 2020, it was $440. It has kept climbing since. Hobart renters now pay only 10% less than renters in Melbourne, while earning 22% less than they do. And that gap is the entire problem expressed in two numbers. The drivers are not mysterious, and nobody in the state disputes them. Incomes in Tasmania remain the lowest in the country, which was true in 1901 and is true now. Not enough new housing has been built, and a significant quantity of the housing that already existed has been withdrawn from the residential market and turned over to short-stay holiday letting, because a house near the waterfront or under the mountain earns more from visitors in a week than from a tenant in a month. The people carrying that cost are the ones who never left. The century of departure had a survivor population, the families who stayed through the closures, the ones with the government jobs, and the small houses in the northern suburbs, and on the eastern shore, the ones who were there when the bridge came down, and there when the mills closed. Rising rents do not reach them as an abstraction about demand. They reach them as a lease renewal. The state that could not hold its young people because there was nothing for them now cannot hold them because they cannot afford a bedroom, which is the same sentence arriving from the other end. None of this is a verdict on the museum, and the numbers do not support one. A city cannot be poor and cheap forever and then become desirable without a price attached. And no one in Hobart has yet found a way to have the visitors, the airline seats, and the winter festival without the lease renewal. The island spent 200 years trying to attract capital. It succeeded once in a way nobody had planned, through a man who was never trying to fix anything. The Hobart rivulet is still running. It comes off the mountain the way it always has, through the tree ferns and down through South Hobart past the walls of the female factory, and then it goes underground into a culvert beneath the streets of the modern city, and comes out at the harbour where the settlement was put ashore in 1804. Almost nobody sees it. Above it, on the western side of Sullivan's Cove, the sandstone warehouses of Salamanca Place stand in the same row they have stood in since the whaling money built them, and in the late afternoon the light comes down the Derwent from the west and lands on the stone, and the stone goes the colour of butter for about an hour, the way it does when the weather is clear and the mountain has snow on it. A dozen kilometres upriver, the same sandstone has 3 floors of rooms cut down into it, below the ground, where there is no daylight and no weather, and the temperature does not change. The river runs past both of them at the speed it has always run, out through Storm Bay into the Southern Ocean, and there is nothing between there and the ice.